So for our final chapter, we're going to be looking at humans in a larger picture. We're going to be looking at human evolution. So while we go through this chapter, let's think about the following things. We're going to define what chemical evolution is, what biological evolution is, what is natural selection and the 3 elements that are required for natural selection, what was Darwin's contribution with evolution, and then what have we learned from the fossil record? And then we're going to dive into some of the evidence we have in favor of evolution, including fossil, biogeographical, anatomical, and biochemical evidence that supports evolution by common descent. We're also going to look at analogous, homologous, and vestigial structures and identify some examples for each of those. Additionally, we're going to classify humans, where do we fall in the grand scheme of things, and look at the characteristics that we have in common with primates. We're going to talk about the evolution of hominids and who Lucy is. We're going to explain the evolution of humans, and then what is the most widely accepted hypothesis for the evolution of modern humans, and compare and contrast Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals. So let's get into the very, very beginnings, pre-life, pre-cells, where we're looking at chemical evolution. Now there's a few steps involved with chemical evolution. First, we had a very primitive atmosphere, and that primitive atmosphere formed the first small organic molecules in the form of gases. These small organic molecules then started to join together to form macromolecules, larger molecules, things like carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. Those 4 classes that we learned about way, way, way back in the beginning of this course. And one of the hypotheses is that RNA came first when it came to forming the first cells. That RNA was the only thing needed instead of DNA, because RNA can actually act both as a form of genetic storage or genetic information storage, as well as act as an enzyme. So it has a dual purpose, and that dual purpose is extremely important to supporting living things. Once we form these macromolecules and we have this component, we have this molecule that can now store and hand off information, we start to see what we call a protocell. A protocell is made of proteins and lipids, and it can metabolize organic molecules, but it lacked one key feature of real true cells. Protocells cannot reproduce. So the protocell was the prototype. Think of it like that. The prototype to the cells. It had pretty much all of the mechanisms in place, except it could not make more of itself. Once we have a cell that can replicate, we are now considered a true cell. And that true cell can reproduce and is now using DNA as its own genetic material. So let's look at how things were moving. We have very, very early Earth, and we see a lot of inorganic chemicals. After some energy capture and some abiotic synthesis, so non-living synthesis, we see small organic molecules begin to form, and that's where we start to kind of really dive into chemical evolution. We then bring multiple of those units together. We call that process polymerization. They're lengthening because the subunits are joining together. We call those polymers. Those polymers come together to form the first plasma membrane. We start to see the first plasma membrane, which gives us our protocell. And again, the protocell can do almost everything a true cell can. It can metabolize things, it can use cellular respiration, it can use fermentation, it can use anaerobic respiration. It can do all of those things except reproduce. Once we get to the point where we can reproduce, we've entered into the biological evolution stage. We have DNA, we have RNA, we can make more copies. And that's where we come into biological evolution, which is probably what you think of when you think of the term evolution. You probably don't think all the way back to pre-cell times. And for the sake of this class, when I say evolution by itself, I'm primarily referring to biological evolution. Biological evolution is a concept that just means that a population or a species is going to change over time. And that's really the end like the end definition of evolution is just change over time. It's one of those things that some people attach the wrong definition to and misunderstand it, when that's all we're saying is that a population or a species is going to have change happen over time from one generation to the next to the next. And there's two important points that come from the biological evolution point, and that is that living things, because we've gone through this change over time and we've split into many, many groups, that there's a common ancestor. We share common ancestry, we share common chemistry, and that living things also adapt to their environment. Adaptation, or if something adapts, adaptation is just a characteristic or a trait that you have that lets an organism survive and reproduce in its current environment. It's kind of like an advantage, basically. It's something that gives that organism the ability to survive and ability to thrive under the current conditions. Natural selection is where things get more controversial, so to speak. Natural selection is a process that drives evolution. And this was the theory first proposed by Charles Darwin, that he described natural selection as the mechanism that allows or drives a species to adapt to its environment. So it's important to note that evolution and natural selection, while they are related terms, they don't actually mean the same thing. Evolution simply refers to change over time. Natural selection is the process that drives that change. And there's three main things that are required for natural selection to work. Number one, there has to be variation. There needs to be physical differences between the individuals in a group. Those differences must be inherited. And the ultimate source for all of these differences is mutation. So mutation, while we have talked about it in terms of things like cancer and whatnot, and it seems very negative, sometimes mutation can be a good thing. We would not have the diversity we see if it wasn't for mutation. So variation, the differences from individual to individual, are required for natural selection to work. Natural selection needs to select for something, and if everyone is exactly the same, there's nothing to really select for. It would just simply be random, and that's not the case. Our second element is competition. Some of those different individuals are going to outcompete others. Resources are limited. Food, shelter, mates, all of those things are in limited supply. And so there's going to be some individuals, because of the traits they have, that are going to capture more of those resources than others. And that's going to allow them to survive and reproduce and have more offspring that are able to survive and reproduce as well. And lastly, our last element is adaptation. Remember, the variations we talked about, the differences from individuals, they need to be inherited. There needs to be a genetic component that can be passed from one generation to the next. And so over time, those certain traits that are positively selected for, meaning they give an advantage to those individuals have more offspring. The less advantageous traits don't survive as well or don't have as many offspring. And so over time, you see a shift in favor of that advantageous trait. So over time, the population will seem like it's increasing in that number. The individuals who are surviving and thriving are going to have that positive trait, and the ones that are not surviving and thriving don't have that positive trait. So over time, from one generation to the next, you see more and more individuals showing that advantageous trait, as long as the environment has not changed. We'll get into that in just a second. But let's look at the two proposals back from Darwin's time. Now, back in Darwin's time, evolution was not controversial as people think. Evolution was something that was already talked about regularly. However, what Darwin brought to the table that was new was the mechanism, natural selection, which he called descent with modification. And so there were competing ideas in addition to Darwin's, and the one we're going to look at is from Lamarck. So Lamarck and Darwin both had proposals of what drove natural selection, or what drove evolution. Lamarck's proposal was this, and we're going to use giraffes as the example. You have a bunch of giraffes that have short necks. So across the board, everyone has short necks. But over time, because the food was so high, they had to stretch and stretch and stretch, and that somehow lengthened their necks. And because they had these long necks over time that they had stretched out, they somehow passed on that trait. So all the giraffes have long necks, and then when they have their offspring, the offspring somehow inherited the long necks from their parents. A modern day approach to this would be like if you dyed your hair purple and then had children when you had purple hair, that your offspring would be born with purple hair. Now, that doesn't quite make sense in today's world if we use that modern example. You're probably thinking, of course my babies would not have purple hair. I artificially changed that color. It's not actually purple, I just modified my body. And it's the same thing here. Lamarck thought that those changes could be inherited. On Darwin's side, he said that there was variation in neck length amongst the entire population of giraffes, so some had longer necks and some had shorter necks. Because the food is so high up, those with longer necks were able to eat more and support more offspring, while those with short necks did not eat as much and could not survive as long or have as many offspring. And so over time, those with long necks were selected for because they could reach the resources that they needed.